My name is Per. I'm a support engineer with our Lund office. I've been with Qlik since about 2010. Today we're going to talk about the Qlik web connectors. So we're going to look a little bit at what they actually are and what they do. I'm sure most of the people in this call have some idea about that. Maybe some even run it in production right now. We're going to look at the architecture and how they work a bit, a few deployment options, and then the meat of the session is going to be troubleshooting, demo, and we'll do some takeaways at the end, and the QA, of course. So let's get started. What are the Qlik web connectors? So it's basically a light web service that gives you easy access to a lot of web data sources. So a lot of social media sources, a lot of cloud sources like Dropbox. We'll take a look at the over 40 connectors that are included at the moment. So these are the premium connectors, and no need to scramble to screenshot this or write it down. It's all available on help.qlik.com. Premium connectors means that these do require a license. They need to be in your LEF. There's our standard connectors. They are free without the license, without the LEF. Also available on help.qlik.com. And we have some beta connectors as well. And just like the standard connectors, they do not require LEF to try out. An important note about them is that if you need support for them, you might not be able to go through the regular support channels. We might not be able to help you with them since they're still in development. But there is a forum on Qlik community. And there's a nice little link in the interface to that when you enable the beta connectors, where you can get direct help from the developers on these beta connectors. So that's pretty nice. All right. So we'll take a quick look at the system requirements for the web connectors. There's really nothing special here. Windows 7 and up, Server 2008 and up. You do need .NET 4.5.2. The resource usage is very light for these connectors. We'll look a bit at why that is as well. You will almost always need internet access for this to work. Most of these connectors access web sources, so no real way around that. There are some of them that work with internal sources though. The browsers we support are the same as for Qlik Sense. That's all available on help.qlik.com. And it works with both Qlik View and Qlik Sense. So how do they actually work? So the Qlik Web Connectors is a .NET application. It's a single executable. It contains all the connectors as separate DLL files, and you enable them individually with the license that you apply. It can also be run as a Windows service, which is quite handy, and we'll actually look at how to enable that a bit later. So it sets up a lightweight web server, and by default it runs on localhost on port 5555/web. And this web server hosts up the user interface that you'll use to configure your web connector. But it's also this web service that responds to requests from the load script when you do the actual reload from your Qlik product, which is quite important when troubleshooting. So we will look at that. All the data is in XML format. You have your settings and log files. For example, there's a deploy.config that can be good to be aware of if you're troubleshooting. These files are generally located in the app data folder in the XE location. We have a nice little diagram here that shows the architecture. It's a bit dense, but basically you have the DLLs here, one for each connector. And one of the reasons that the web service is so lightweight is that it will only load a DLL when it actually needs to use it. So even if there are 40 different connectors, those will of course not all be loaded unless you actually use one. So we have our different folders here. The log files folder, we'll look at that. Cache data user settings. If your request to your web API is still in the cache set, stored in the cache data folder, which will of course improve the performance. You'll have your Qlik viewer, Qlik sense implementation interfacing with this, and you'll have your administrator accessing it via the browser to access the UI. We'll go through the installation real quick. It's very simple. There is no installer because it doesn't need to make any changes to the system unless you want to install as a service. So you simply download a zip file. We've had quite a few support cases where we've seen issues with this zip file block that Windows has. It's a fantastic feature, but it's important to be aware of that if you get error messages while launching the application, specifically if it's trying to access resources that it can't access for some reason, like DLL files, for example, this is likely the root cause. You will need to check the unblock checkbox before unzipping it. I actually did try this before the call today, and on my machine it worked fine even if it was blocked. So that seems to be system specific. We do recommend running this from the C drive, from just a root folder called Qlik Web Connectors. That makes things a bit easier for you. But if you for some reason have to run it somewhere else, it's no problem. That should work as well. At that point, you're done, unless you want to run this as a Windows service. And there are reasons to do that, right? If you want to manage this in a larger deployment, having it run as a Windows service has its benefits. You can also configure it to start up automatically. If you're just running the desktop client, you start it. As you can see here, you run the exe file, you get this nice little window, and for troubleshooting reasons, if the web service is for some reason not able to bind this address, it will tell you that here. You'll get a nice little error message, and there's a startup log that you can use to diagnose those problems. If it does open and run successfully, you can open the UI, the interface, in the default browser by clicking this link, which looks a bit like this. We'll get into that in a bit. If you want to run it as a Windows service, you have to run the included batch file, which is called install service.bat. It's located in the batch files folder, and you need to verify that the path to the .NET framework and to the actual service exe file are correct. So if you've moved this somewhere else, it needs to be changed. So once you're up and running, it's a good idea to make sure that you can actually access everything. The web service has this sort of test page that you can use, which is just an XML file. An interesting thing is that, of course, you can open it in the browser. But you can also use this in your Qlik load script for sense or view, just to add some error checking logic, right? You can make sure that before you start your load scripts, you check if everything is up and running, if it's licensed, if the version is still the version you expect it to be, and so on. And of course, you can add some notifications there to your administrators if you have failures. We'll go through the license real quick. There's nothing special here. You go to the license tab in the user interface. You add your name and your organization, serial number, control number, and you apply the lef. And as you can see here in the lef file, you have one line for each connector that you've actually added. And once you've successfully licensed everything, you'll be able to see that in the interface that it has a little green true next to it. We'll go through some example deployments real quick. This is, of course, the most simple version where you run QlikSense or QlikView, it doesn't matter, on a single server together with the web connectors, which is not really a problem from a performance perspective, since this is very lightweight. the optional configuration would be to instead put the web connectors on a separate machine. Maybe not for performance reasons, but for security concerns, because you do need internet access. Maybe you don't want your sense server to be in the DMZ. And of course, we see here we have end users accessing the sense server. We have developers accessing either the sense server or the web connector interface separately. There are a few steps that you need to take in both of these deployments just to make sure that you can access the web connectors remotely. By default, remote access is disabled, so you can only access everything from localhost. I would recommend that if you're doing this setup, check out the guide on help.qlik.com. We're not going to go into super detail on that because we have a very good step-by-step guide on how to set it up. The basics of it are that you need to enable the flag that allows remote access. You need to make sure the ports are open, of course. At this point, it's probably a good idea to look into authentication, which you can also enable on the web connectors to make sure that not everyone has access. And then there is the whitelist, which is a concept we'll look at a bit closer. But it basically means that any service or server that wants to load data from the web connectors needs to be added to a whitelist to be allowed to pull that data, which is quite important from a security perspective, of course. All right, let's get into the troubleshooting. So we have a few basics that we just go through here. This may seem obvious, but usually when you're troubleshooting your web connectors, you're not really starting at the web connector. Usually the problem will occur in your data reload, so you'll probably start from that end, and at some point you realize, oh, this might be a problem with the web connector. So at that point, you need to check that everything is up and running and licensed. And for most of this, you will of course need an internet connection. Usually it's not as simple as just having lost all internet to that machine. That's usually pretty obvious. But you might have intermittent issues, or you might have DNS issues or proxy issues. All of those will, of course, impact this connector since it needs to be able to access its web data source. There's a few good things to just be aware of. If you see a field not found error like this in QlikView, the error is a bit different in sense, but we'll look at that in the demo. It usually means that the web connector is returning an error page instead of the QVX table that you're expecting. So at that point, you just want to copy this URL. We'll look a lot closer at that in the demo, and put it into a browser. Because if the web connector is not able to get to the data that it needs, it will give you a nice error page, which will look a bit like this. Hopefully with an exception that will tell you what's actually going on. In this case, you can see it here, right? If your request works in the browser and you do get your data, but not in the in your reload, it's likely that it was a temporary issue that caused it. So there's plenty of those with APIs, right? You can have quota issues, or you can have throttling issues like anti-spam and that kind of stuff. We'll talk a bit more about that later. So there's a lot of log files available to diagnose things. There is a startup log, like we mentioned earlier. It's right next to the exe file if you need that, if things are not starting up. There are general error logs, and the web connector interface has this nice log files tab where you can find the full log file. Also a pretty handy little latest error page here, which gives you the latest error, which is usually relevant while you're troubleshooting. So that's pretty good. The log file can also be found on disk in the app data logs folder. So we have a few common issues that we see in support. Proxy issues is something that does show up quite a bit. And for example, if your proxy requires authentication, manual authentication to be able to reach out to the web, that does need to be configured. often you'll see an HTTP 407 error in the response or log files. That's not always the case, but that's a good hint. Legacy mode. So you don't have to turn on legacy mode in Sense in order for the web connector to work. But if you want to use the full URL as the data source, instead of using a lib connection, you do need to change it from standard mode. We will look at that in the demo, just so everyone is aware of what that means. But that is a fairly common support case. Hitting API limits. So what does that mean? Well, a lot of these web APIs have quotas. For most of them, we are managing those quotas, and we do monitor them regularly, so that if we realize that our volume is too low for some of those quotas, we raise them before there are any issues. Should you see errors coming back from your APIs with quota errors, just get in touch with us with support. In my experience, those are fixed very quickly by our developer team. So, but still, contact us for sure. API version changes, right? That happens. APIs change. And for the big ones, you know, Google and Facebook and that kind of stuff, they are usually pretty good about announcing when they change things in their APIs. So we try to stay on top of that and make sure that the web connector can handle those. It'll still happen occasionally that things slip through. So if you suddenly have strange issues with your API calls, it's a good idea to check their version history to see if something important has changed. And then there's the actual configuration, right? And making sure you actually get the data that you're asking for. And you can absolutely contact us if you have problems setting things up or not getting what you're expecting. But in a lot of these cases, you simply have to go to the API provider and try to figure out from their documentation what's going on. We're not experts in all the APIs out there, unfortunately. All right, so let's take a look at how this works. So I've set up a small demo here. I'm running the web connectors not as a service, but as an executable. I'm running it locally on my machine, so I haven't had to configure anything specific here in order to access it. And as we can see, it's running fine, and it's been able to bind, the web service has been able to bind this address. So I've already opened the web interface right here. We have our premium connectors here. I've set up a test using one of our standard connectors with our mailbox IMAP connector. So I'll show you one of the reasons here why the web connectors are very handy to use. Of course, for something like this, I could have also used the REST connector, since this is all a REST API. But the web connectors have some very handy stuff that makes this a lot easier for me to set up. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I can authenticate to my Gmail account. I've added my server, my port, username and password, and this is my personal Gmail, so please don't sign me up for any spam. And we're just going to run this and see what happens. So we get a authenticated true response back immediately. What I've had to do was, of course, to go into my Gmail account and make sure it allows unsafe applications to connect, since I use two-factor authentication otherwise. And that's most likely something, maybe not that specifically, but for most of these APIs, you will have to make sure that you do allow applications to actually access them. So it's something to keep in mind. So that works fine. And as you notice, I didn't have to build any strings here. I just used the built-in functions. I'm going to use a more advanced function to get messages in a folder using the same parameters. I've set the folder to default, which is inbox, and I'm going to grab 10 of my emails. So we're going to run that, and it's going to reach out to that API. It might take a few seconds to get a response. And there we go. So I get a nice little preview of my 10 emails, and I get a script generated for me, both for Qlik View and for Qlik Sense. You get some messages here that are quite handy to be aware of. For example, it tells you that you do need to whitelist whatever machine is going to be loading this script. In my case, I'll be doing it from the localhost, so it's not a problem. And you get a warning here about standard mode. So we will look at that, but I will just copy the script. And I'm running Qlik Sense desktop locally, and I've already pasted it in. Fantastic. So in this particular instance, I've already disabled standard mode. So I'm running in the legacy mode where I can use this type of syntax from my from statements. So I can put the full URL here. If I didn't want to do this, I could instead add it like I've done here as a lib connection. And I can actually use, I'll show you how to do that, right? I'll use web file. I'll paste the URL here, and I'll put the name of the connection here. So it's this URL, right? I would paste this URL. And that would work fine even in standard mode. If I for some reason wanted to modify this URL dynamically, for example, if I wanted to add custom paging or other advanced data transformation, then it definitely makes sense to turn off standard mode so I can use this format. If you don't, go ahead and stay in standard mode and use this. That's not a problem. So I'm not even going to reload this since it's going to give us a pretty predictable response. I'm going to get my 10 emails, but I will show you the troubleshooting step here. So I'm going to copy this URL. I'll go back into my browser, and I'll paste that here, and I'll just remove the brackets. So at this point, the web connector will reach out to my Gmail, ask for my email, and what you can see here is that I actually get the full QVX table, which is what we want. That's a very good sign that things are working as it should. If I scroll down, I'll see here's probably my first email ever from Gmail from 2005 or something. So that works well. Let's try and break things. So we'll go back into Qlik Sense, and I will just change the port number to 994, which is wrong. And I could, of course, have gone into the web connector here instead and gone for the port here, change that. But then I would have to copy the script again. So it's a lot quicker for me to just modify it in Qlik Sense. So let's load that. And you'll immediately notice that this will also take a few seconds before anything happens, which is usually a good sign that we're at least hitting something. So it's an indication that we're talking to the web connector, and the web connector is trying to do something, but clearly not doing very well. So it fails. And the error message that we get in Qlik Sense is not very useful. It won't tell us very much. So what do we do to actually find out what the issue is? Of course, we'll copy the URL. We'll paste it, and let's remove the brackets. And again, we'll have to wait a few seconds for it to reach out, since we don't have a cached response. And hopefully we'll get a nice error message here with an exception that will tell us what's going on. Yes. So we didn't get a QVX table, which is the reason why we failed. Instead, we got this XML file from the web connector, and it does show us an exception here. What it tells us is that the connection failed because the host has failed to respond, which is a good first step, right, into knowing that we accidentally specified the wrong port. So that's very nice. What you could also do here is go back to the interface, hit the log files tab, and hit the latest error tab. I'll show us the same thing. So that's also a quick way of checking this. All right, so let's try one more scenario here. So we're going to simulate what happens if you actually have no contact at all to the web service. Could be because you've forgotten to whitelist, could be because the port is blocked, or simply because it's not running. So we'll actually kill the connector. And if I start loading here, as you notice here, we get a response very quickly because there's nothing answering at all on that address. So even just something like that, where if you get a very quick failure, that will give you some information about um, in which layer this error happened in, right? So we got no response at all, and the error is not great, but it does tell us that we need to take a look at our web connector. What is it actually doing? If I should copy it and paste this URL now, it would just give us a 404 immediately with nothing answering on that address. All right, so that's pretty much it for the demo. We'll move on to some takeaways here. So pretty simple, right? We'll always try to troubleshoot with the browser. That's our main tool. Copy those URLs, see what the response is. You need to know your APIs. The web connector does make things a lot easier for you to set this up, formats things for you, and builds the connection strings for you. But you still need to know what you're doing, at least a little bit. And use the log files. They're actually very good for the web connector, and use the last error while troubleshooting to find out what's going on. All right, let's move on to questions. Yeah, so I have one here actually, which is a fairly common issue as well. Uh, someone has downloaded the connector, but they're getting the error that there's a new version available, and that's a bit tricky, right? So we do push new versions pretty hard with the web connectors, just because the APIs do update. So we don't want people on older versions of this. You actually have to upgrade at least once a year, which is a very smooth process with the web connector since there's not even an installer, right? You can even simply switch out individual DLLs if you wanted to do that. But it is required to upgrade. So just make sure that you grab the latest version from the download site, and you should be fine. If you still get that message, obviously contact us, but do make sure you grab the latest version. We've got a question about multi-node environments and if there are any special considerations. We talked a bit about the whitelisting, right? So you will of course need to whitelist everything. Other than that, I don't think it's a big problem. If you have several reload nodes, you definitely want to go in there and make sure you test that you can reach the web service. So use that, is it up URL from every node to see if you get a response. We've got some questions about upcoming connectors. I actually don't have a ton of information about that. Of course, the beta connectors are a good indication of what we're working on at the moment. If you have requests for connectors to be added, then get in touch with support. We can forward that information to the developers. And we got some more questions about error handling. So there's no reason why you couldn't add logic to parse the XML error messages from the web connector. You would need to, of course, figure out that there is an error first, but that should absolutely be doable. If you can't find the first table, for example, the first field, you could instead look for the XML table. And you could probably pull out the exception there, or the error code at least, and do some smart logic with that if you wanted to be really error safe. And we got some questions about security, of course. So we have had a few cases now where some APIs actually haven't moved over from TLS 1.0, which is no longer supported. So in those cases, there's not much we can do. Those versions of TLS and SSL should not be used at all at this point. So you will actually have to contact that API provider and try to get them to upgrade. And questions about updating. As I mentioned, that is pretty straightforward since there is no real installation here. All you should have to do is unzip the new file, and everything should work. The services should still be pointing at the same place. So That's very low maintenance. Yeah, we got another question about legacy mode, right? So the question is if it affects anything else in the platform. And that is a pretty big switch over, right? And it is a global switch, so that will affect all your load scripts. But there is a good help page on standard mode. If you go to help.qlik.com, check out the Qlik Sense area and search for standard mode. And we can link that later as well. But definitely read that through so you understand the full implications of switching that over, because it's a global switch. If you have been doing any fancy paging or even paging with QBDs or files on disk, you've probably already run into this. You're probably already familiar with it.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you to Per for presenting. We always appreciate getting experts like Per to present, share with us. We've got a legal disclaimer for you. Could you show the, yeah, next, there we go. And next slide is thank you once again and have a great rest of your day.